Beginning of week 10. Sounds great. I'm hearing through the room monitors too. You might want to turn those levels down. Voice of God effect. All right. We're actually going to travel beyond the normal limits of 1877, which is beyond Reconstruction, because I want to set up next term, which basically we will start in 1877 because there will of necessity be some overlap, but to kind of talk about what's going on with contemporary society. I hope the live feed didn't just go down as it's not showing the monitors, but I'm going to prod John anyway. So where we're going to end up is later this week is the Berlin Conference, which if you don't know what that means, don't be surprised that you don't, because it's one of the things that kind of affects contemporary Africa and America today. So, but starting with Black Reconstruction. So, Reconstruction is basically after the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, if you will. It's acts by Congress basically to divide the South into 5 military districts under the command of generals. Now, understand the legal relationship of what a general is in wartime. A general in wartime reports to their commander-in-chief or the chain of command, the civilian government, but they are representatives of their government. So they can make changes or field proclamations or other things within the context of wartime that have the force of law. So I usually talk about Reconstruction, particularly when we're looking at the Iraq War, and Iraq and Iran, the whole Middle East. When we talk about bringing democracy to those places, it's basically, we're bringing democracy to places that have had civil war by enforcing an outside authority and thinking that that will stick. And it won't, right? So if you study history, Reconstruction is exactly like that. The South lost. The South's economy was based on slavery, but technological changes were going to make slavery irrelevant because that labor was going to be done by machines, some of it. So that meant slavery was going to essentially be irrelevant, just like today. You can't be a student here unless you're on the right side of the digital divide. Now, some of that work that you are preparing to do can be done by an app, but a lot of it can't be. So we might be coming up into the same kind of situation. So I'm not going to dampen your hopes for success post, but you should be aware of that kind of trend within society. So Reconstruction starts as acts by Congress to divide the South into 5 military districts under the command of generals. And they order election for constitutional conventions. So if you don't understand, for example, why many of our presidents have been lawyers, or politicians who become lawyers, it's because you need a law degree practically to understand at the same level what a constitution is and does, right? And if you didn't have a constitution, then you have to be able to create one. And essentially, in wartime Reconstruction, this is what's happening to the South. Yeah?
Is that much the same as martial law?
Martial law is, great question. It is under martial law, but here's what we're trying to force. We're trying to force democracy, okay? By the gun. you will allow these people to vote and become leaders under the gun. You will allow them the capacity to be able to do what they're doing. So, for example, in Reconstruction, you start seeing the first black politicians, and these black politicians are way different from anybody that you'd expect to see today. But before we get to that, let's continue with this. So, the military has to order the status of blacks being changed in many cases. Now, under martial law, yes, you're under martial law, but the army, if, for example, even though the Ku Klux Klan won't exist for another 2 years at this point, there is still a terroristic impulse. Very much so. So is the military going to take white men who have formed these mobs and shoot them? Probably not. But they will keep the peace, somewhat. So Reconstruction, essentially in a democracy, which we style ourselves to be, starts with voting. You have constitutional conventions to rewrite the constitutions of southern states. Now, this is to basically say that, look, in a lot of cases, there are more slaves than white people, for more black people than white people. Therefore, if majority rules, what are they going to do? This is certainly a fear of folks. If you see a representation of that time in the form of Birth of a Nation, basically they're talking about, yeah, well, these blacks are going to be corrupt and et cetera, et cetera. Well, not always. So, but the Constitutional Convention to rewrite the constitutions of the southern states, which allows black policemen, black jurors, black officials, eventually black lawyers, black judges, black senators, black congressional representatives, all where it had never happened before. Now, with the idea that I grew up with slavery, even though I knew different from my family history, but what was taught to me as history in school, I wasn't taught in school that slaves could speak multiple languages, or did speak multiple languages, and or some cultivated literacy. I wasn't taught that, even though I did know that in my own family, that we cultivated literacy and we were a typical story of that. We didn't necessarily do multiple languages, except that French was spoken by my father at home from being stationed in France, so I had to learn French, I had to learn Spanish, and I had to learn all these different other things. So here you have a piece where you understand from our previous weeks in terms of the ancient African constitutional law and the social structure that people were prepared for urban civilized roles. And so we weren't taught that. And so we don't understand in this particular time, wait, all of a sudden you're slaves and then next week you're policemen and judges, and how can you do that? Where's the infrastructure to create that? Where's that coming from? Yeah, Eddie.
Case of American history versus black history.
Right.
What you leave out.
Right, what you leave out, yeah. So, for example, the first election in the South was in Alexandria, Virginia, which, if you understand this, right across the river from Washington, D.C. The election commissioners refused to count 1,400 black votes. Now, this is when black people, you actually had to write to vote, right? So the military suspends local elections pending the status of clarification of the status of the freedmen. So this is also what black people were called, the freedmen. Like, you're not slaves anymore, but freedmen is not necessarily citizen. There is a difference, and notice that language also used in the Indian nations. Black Indians are not necessarily referred to as native tribes people, they are freedmen. Particularly where in the 5 civilized tribes, they were slaves, i.e. distinct from the tribe, but not exactly white people either. So the clarification, the constitutional amendments clear enough? Did the Civil Rights Bill stutter? And actually we'll get into what that was, what that will be later in the broadcast, but voting. So Reconstruction era politicians, PBS Pinchback from Mississippi, Hiram Revels, a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Blanche Kelso Bruce, another U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and then another exemplar, not the only one, but one of many, Robert T. Greener. Greener was a professor of mental and moral philosophy at the University of South Carolina, where he served as a librarian, taught philosophy, and assisted in the departments of Latin and Greek, mathematics, and constitutional history. So note the time and how he could have been, there'll be a little, you could actually research him if you wanted to, but 1875, he becomes the first African-American to be elected to the member of the American Philological Association, primary academic society for classical studies in North America. Now, when we're talking about classical studies, we're not talking about Africa. We're talking about what white people consider classical, Greece. So note, Greek and Latin, all right? So Latin is not only the language of the law, but the language of science. Greek is a language of philosophy. And many of our words in English come from Greek, German, Latin, etc. So he received an LLB degree at the University of South Carolina's Law School in 1876, graduating with honors. He was admitted to the Supreme Court of South Carolina in 1877 and the Bar of D.C. the next year in 1882, the next year in 1878. In 1882, he received a doctorate conferred by Monrovia College in Liberia, Africa. And in 1907 was honored with another LLD conferred by Howard in D.C. Yes?
What was his status before emancipation?
Yeah, good question. That is not in the narrative, but I would imagine, unless he was a free black, he could have been a slave. And a lot of these Reconstruction era politicians weren't free. They were, in fact, slaves. And one of the things that when I was first putting together the class, one of the things that amazed me was, wait, as soon as they get free, they're like hungry for learning. Not only are they hungry for learning, but they're actually like traveling to Europe, traveling abroad, speaking multiple languages with those folks and coming back and being politicians. You know, very much like we are used to here in the 20th and 21st century. Yeah.
Might he have been a northern free black man who then went south? Possible. Studying
I should know this, but I use it as a story for in case the student wants to look into the status of Mr. Greener first. Yes, a research project. Wouldn't be a bad thing, right? In 1879, he was appointed Dean of Howard University's Law Department, and in 1881, opened a private law practice in Washington. So, wow. Sometime inside of 20 years after the Civil War, he's a practicing lawyer. So it would be interesting to know what he was before all this. So, the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. So, sounds familiar, Civil Rights Bill, right? So, when the Selma March happened for voting rights, you know, the basic position was, look, we already have this right constitutionally guaranteed. That's correct, right? But it's about enforcement. So, here it is. All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Now, pretty much what this is saying is, okay, no more Jim Crow. No more separate but equal. No more peanut gallery. I know that, let me be explicit with that reference. Peanut gallery, or nigger heaven, shall we say, the less polite term. So, in Jim Crow segregation, which was still true in Eugene, definitely up until 1965, and definitely up until the then legislator Hatfield, who became a U.S. senator and then became governor, created an Oregon civil rights bill. That's actually what he called it, mirrored after this in terms of public accommodation. So you could actually find signs in the Salem, Oregon bus station that would say, "Welcome to Salem, largest white city west of the Mississippi." We had segregated bus station, people sitting in the back of the bus, separate schools, et cetera, in the 20th century. So basically what was happening here, and you can see the actual buildings, not so much here, but for example, there's a theater in Ashland on Main Street that actually had a separate entrance for separate colored entrance. So you couldn't go, if you were black, you couldn't go through, or actually non-white, you couldn't go through the front door. You had to go to the side door to buy tickets. And then you couldn't use the bathrooms. So they would sell you condiments and, popcorn and candy and stuff like that separately, but you couldn't use the bathroom, so you were actually relegated to the top 2 or 3 rows in the balcony in the theater. You couldn't sit wherever you wanted. It had to be in the peanut gallery, which, of course, since they're not doing trash and all the other kinds of things, it gets messy. People make comments and throw things at the screen, whatever. No comments from the peanut gallery. When I first heard my father use that, and he said, "Peanut gallery, what's that?" And then he explained it and go, "Wow, that's kind of like the back of the bus." Yeah, exactly like that. All right, so this is what this civil rights bill is talking about. So obviously, just like in original position, what were they thinking? You do not forbid something that's not happening. So obviously discrimination is happening in public accommodations and theaters, restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. So civil rights on paper, essentially. Sounds good, but what about when I go to a restaurant, a theater, and they won't serve me or let me in? Where do I go complain when a policeman arrests me because I won't leave a restaurant? Right? So the civil rights law is federal, but the feds ain't, even though they do have jurisdiction, they're not basically overcoming local custom in Selma, Alabama, or wherever. So in Reconstruction, so the war is over, theoretically. We won. We's free now. We's American citizens, but apparently not real Americans. We're free to go where, when, how we please or can afford. So learn Black history. What was once done to us because of race, it will be done to you because of the money. The chains come off, they simply create new and different chains. So in no case will white rights be abridged, that is limited, or will white privilege be abolished or eliminated, even and / especially in the cause of justice. So after all, for example, in the Dred Scott decision, Supreme Court Justice Taney said blacks could not be citizens and the Constitution guarantees the Negro, quote, "no rights that a white man need respect," unquote. And that was before the Civil War. So we fight the Civil War, and that Supreme Court decision still stands, even though Congress makes laws to the contrary. So let's start with the legal DNA, the Constitution. So the Constitution can get amended. But it starts from a certain position where it defines, for example, as we talked about a few weeks ago, the nine interlocking articles that protect slavery. So when you change that, without rewriting the Constitution, you are essentially almost contradicting yourself. So for example, the 13th Amendment, which is passed on January 31, 1865, there are certain portions of this, as I pointed out early, came out of Oregon law, the Oregon Constitution, where the Oregon Constitution, if you recall, basically abolishes slavery by simply criminalizing the black presence in Oregon. So we're not doing slavery, but if you're here, you're a criminal. And so we can work you. So that provision got imported into, as a meme, got imported into the U.S. Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, that is, you're working as a servant against your will, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So basically, this is almost line for line for what was happening in Oregon. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So basically, in the Oregon one, you can be sold to the lowest bidder because you're here illegally, and we can work you for up to 3 years. And your owner, not your owner, the person that you're indentured to serve, has to post a bond. And that the Oregon legislature has the right to basically pass laws to make sure that this is carried out. Yeah.
So it's the new plantation.
It's a new plantation, right. Okay, so it's the states that decide what's legal or illegal and how that's going to be enforced. The Constitution basically gives you the framework under which you can operate. So the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is the infamous equal protection clause that gave Bush the election in 2000, according to the Supreme Court. So basically what this is saying is that if you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen. Even if your parents were here illegally, you born on soil, you are a citizen. So anyone born on American soil is an American. So Barack, of course, was born in Hawaii, automatically an American citizen. Doesn't matter that he lived all over. So any child of illegal immigrants born on U.S. soil is a citizen, though such rights can be abridged because of race. So non-white parents can and have been deported before their kid can get official papers, unless they're from Cuba or some other place like that. Okay, the fight, for example, over Elian Gonzalez proves the law can be ignored for a time for political purposes, the feet wet policy. So I didn't go into that too much, right? And that particular controversy, the reason I bring that up, Elian Gonzalez was a Cuban citizen. Okay? His father still lived in Cuba. His mother wanted to leave. So, took him and his sister and paid money to travel on a leaky boat, which they, instead of having real life jackets, they basically used inner tubes, right? And about a mile off the Cuban coast, the engine failed. so they basically spent the night getting back to shore. Elian's father took his sister, said, no, you're not taking her. So they make another voyage, and the boat sinks. Elian's mother drowns. And there were essentially 4 people that survived that, and Elian basically survived by holding on to an inner tube, and this woman and her boyfriend survived on another inner tube and were picked up by, I think, the Coast Guard and basically allowed to become citizens, except there was this controversy with Elian where people here didn't want to return him, but wait, he's got a father in Cuba who didn't want him to go in the first place. So here was the illumination of this particular policy done in the now defunct George magazine, which was run by John F. Kennedy Jr. And he basically talks about this interesting racial bifurcation where if you're a light-skinned Cuban and you make it to Florida, you get to stay. But if you're a dark-skinned Cuban, you get sent back as if you're a Haitian. Right? So the feet wet policy doesn't apply to dark-skinned Cubans who also face some forms of discrimination in Cuba from the same racial policy that we are heir to in the English-speaking world, where you have skin privilege, and the skin privilege still operates in the Latin-speaking world from the same influences, basically the Spanish Inquisition, et cetera, among other things. So the woman whose boyfriend also was on that voyage, well, he was, as they point out, this gesture, dark. And normally he would have been deported. And that's what the article in George magazine talked about. Yeah, but, she made her uncle give him a job. This is my boyfriend, doesn't matter that he's dark, he's Cuban, et cetera, et cetera. So here's where you see this interesting thing where we pass sort of an interesting immigration law that allows a certain illegal immigrants, people who come here illegally, a pass because they're escaping communism, and if they're light-skinned, we definitely get to keep them here, but if they're dark-skinned, we deport them. All right? So that isn't written. Dark-skinned Cubans get sent back like Haitians, but that becomes the practice, right? So if you look at the Cuban politicians, particularly the ones that are way conservative, they tend to be light-skinned, right? And way conservative and against illegal immigration of Mexicans, et cetera, et cetera. Wait, you're here illegally. And you got a pass because of, the history of your island being, it's communist, but before there was communism, there was also people that were essentially fighting slavery. And that's part of Cuba's legacy, as we saw last week with Mr. Delaney's writings. 14th Amendment, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. So remember, what was in the Constitution is that Southern representatives got apportioned according to the 3/5, they counting the number of slaves and dividing that number by 3/5, so that slaves were 60% of a person, and so they weren't represented in Congress, but congressmen got elected based on their number. So now this is amending that by saying, y'all, in addition to being citizens, now we're also going to apportion representatives based on the whole per capita number, whole number of persons, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote of any election of the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way are abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion to which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such states. Now, all that legal aid says, though many of you probably don't remember this, but I often point out, in middle school, my activism started in '68, where we started working for the 18-year-old vote. Before, the vote was 21. Now we said, wait, we can fight and go to Vietnam at 18, but we can't vote? You can die for your country, but you can't vote in your country? That's crazy. So, petitions, basically had that passed in 71 or 72. You're welcome if you weren't there, but now the 18-year-old vote is a reality. What here basically is saying males only, and then 21. And there were subsequent other amendments that basically gave the vote to women, and then another constitutional amendment that gave the 18-year-old vote. But still keeping the provisions, if you're convicted of a crime, the state can take away your right to vote. And that happens state by state, depending on criminal charges. Yeah.
Didn't it also result in each of those states getting more representatives in Congress?
Yes, it did. It did. It did. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such a disability. So, for example, this would relate to Arnold Schwarzenegger. He could become governor of California by the rules of California, but he can't run for president of the United States. And the public debt, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services and suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned, but neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. That is, hey, wait, we lost the war, we lost our slaves, that was our property, you need to compensate us. No, we ain't doing that. And, if a slave rebellion happened, yeah, under other parts of the Constitution, we were supposed to put those down, but in this case, we ain't gonna. So let's see, the 15th Amendment. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So, part of, then, those amendments to the Constitution, or any amendments to the Constitution, but those in particular coming out of the Civil War, set some of the groundwork for what we're experiencing today, both with elections and both who's a citizen, who's not, how can the right to vote be taken away or conferred, and how race divides, and then other divisions come to the fore in terms of dividing us as well, in terms of class, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Because in these particular things, it's conferring the right to vote to male persons of a certain age, regardless of race, but not, still the country is still at least half women, if not more. What about those folks? Yeah, what about black slave women? Well, white women can't vote, black women can't vote either, even though you have a Sojourner Truth talking about women's rights at women's rights conferences. So in Reconstruction, which is basically essentially a 10-year period between 1867 and 1888, Du Bois called it a mystic time, though he was only 2 years old in the beginning of it. Blacks were elected to high and low office, so not only U.S. senators, but not president, and Congress critters, lieutenant governors, secretaries of states, state supreme courts, justices, treasurers, solicitors, judges, mayors. That would be the low end of the office, but they're being elected to office. Like, I think there's a black mayor of Selma now, right? At least sounded black over the radio, as I racially profiled them. This brave new world resembles our own today somewhat. There's integrated schools somewhat, even though schools are being resegregated through other means. There's public transportation. You don't have to ride in the back of the bus unless that's where the cool kids hang out, right? You can shack up in or out of wedlock. You can have a domestic partner. An interracial board, for example, was running the University of South Carolina, where Richard Greener was teaching racially integrated classes, metaphysics, and logic. So the reason I focused on him is, well, wait a minute. If he's doing all this, what is the university like? Because the reason you have historically black colleges and universities at all is because education was segregated back then. You weren't necessarily going to have black people. You know, when we saw black people getting college degrees, that was mostly happening in Europe and a few other places, but mostly it was segregated. So black mothers could dream their children could become anything, even president. And if this sounds familiar, even though when I was growing up, we didn't really, even though in high school civics, they would say, yes, anybody could become president. Well, we didn't really actually believe that any more than the flag salute. But, okay, sounds nice when you say it. So black mothers often walk 20 miles to put their kids in schools to learn the mighty ABCs. Now, never underestimate the power of the ABCs. So definitely, in terms of literacy, I was watching a piece only semi-nostalgically. It's basically how I came to Oregon. I was working on a project getting black, Hispanic, and white kids off of drugs and out of gangs. And the title was Drug Counselor, but the money, federal money, ended. And I often wondered why. The cover story was, oh, well, it was Reagan being president. He wanted the MX missile. And so the MX missile got funded, and your bill that covered your money did not. So I've been working solid for 16 years, basically figured, okay, the government can pay my unemployment. So the shock was so bad working with gangs that I went to Maui for 3 months. Good place to heal. So meanwhile, what happened? Crack got introduced. So there was a piece on Al Jazeera talking about Freeway Ricky Ross. And Freeway Ricky Ross basically eventually held a position as a crack kingpin working with a particular group of Contras that basically was supplying both the Crips and Bloods and other. Rick Ross wasn't a gang member, but basically the gangs turned out to be the marketing end of the crack epidemic, or a section of them. And reason I brought that up is essentially Rick was illiterate until he got to prison. And he talked about that. Yeah, I was illiterate. Didn't learn to read till I was 28. But, $1 million worth of crack in a day. Yeah, Magic Johnson was making $1 million in a year, and he's scoffing, going, we make that in a day. Right? And he can't read. All right. So the point about the mighty ABCs is, if you don't learn the ABC song, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, if you don't learn that, you don't read. And then what happens? Well, it depends, but, obviously he could become a crack millionaire without learning to read, but that was a deficit in terms of learning what he does now and what, the transformation, the devastation that happened in many lives. So the power of literacy is what I'm getting at. So part of what Reconstruction is happening, what is happening within Reconstruction, is basically the foundations of what slavery did, and essentially beginning to try and repair those. So for example, then you have folks like James Augustine Healy becomes the first black Catholic bishop, because again, the Catholic Church doesn't necessarily have anything to do with American civics being a religious organization, but there were black popes in its history. St. Augustine himself was a Berber, a black African. So the first Catholic bishop during Reconstruction. His brother, Patrick, the first black to earn a PhD, which was essentially in Europe, became the first black president of the Catholic University, Georgetown. Okay, so this happened during Reconstruction too. So when we're looking at Reconstruction as a time period, there are, Du Bois is right. This is a mystical time. You couldn't imagine things like this happening before. So if I hadn't talked about this before with Paulo Freire, the idea about banking, I have talked about this? Yeah. Banking versus problem posing. So banking is basically taking bits of knowledge that are considered legitimate and depositing them in the mind of the student for later regurgitation, versus problem posing, which is saying, okay, here's a problem, and can we solve this from outside of the box? So rather than doing educational bulimia, where you regurgitate those facts, stuff you full of facts, have you regurgitate the facts undigested to check for accuracy, orthodoxy, conformity, so that you may integrate and assimilate into Borg society. Resistance is futile. So rather than do that, we try and think outside of that box. So for example, within Reconstruction, there are field proclamations, right? So my earlier point about generals being representatives of their government. In field proclamations, generals in time of war can make proclamations that have the force of law, in other words, are legally enforceable and binding commitments of their government. Several generals did this in the early Civil War, in effect freeing slaves during wartime, defining them as contraband, that is illegally held property, and we can confiscate them, thereby freeing them, and thus using them in the war effort. So another example of that be the whole 40 acres and a mule thing, which is used as a basis for reparations. In time of war, it's legally binding and is still legally binding. So the idea of 40 acres and a mule. So January 1865, we're still in the war is winding down. General Sherman issues Field Order number 15, giving the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the river for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, for exclusive settlement by blacks. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves. So here's a reality in terms of what it takes to sustain a single human being over the course of a year. You can grow as much food as you can eat if you plant right, if there's, if the seasons are opportune, as much land as you need for an acre. So granting people 40 acres means it's the clear assumption that you're going to make a living with this. And part of the idea of this being the legal, this was also taken up not only by generals, but also by the so-called radical Republicans, basically as reparations for slavery. Okay, we can either pay you for the free labor, 40 acres and a mule, you'll be basically, it could be, 40 acres in a Land Cruiser, 40 acres in a tractor or something, but 40 acres and a mule being reparations for slavery. So 40,000 blacks were given 40-acre tracts in the area of South Carolina under this policy. Sounds good. My man. So in Lincoln, the Spielberg film, Tommy Lee Jones plays Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens was a way cool cat in my estimation. He's one of the radical Republicans. And actually, when you look at him, his actual picture and Tommy Lee Jones, it's actually not a bad casting job, really. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens urges confiscation of estates of Confederate leaders and distributing to adult freedmen. Because remember, it's men that we're dealing with, not women. So what do you people want? Well, we want freedom. We want land. We want an education. The government giveth to the blacks, and the government taketh away if blacks get more than whites. So, for example, what happened with those lands that the government gave under the Field Proclamation? It was given back to the planters. There were educational gains. So, for example, Healy, as we talked about, and is first American black awarded a PhD in Louvain, Belgium. And in the Reconstruction period, the founding of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, begins because we can't have Negroes and whites learning side by side. It may lead to the S&M words, sex and miscegenation. Okay, citizen also, of course, means the right to vote, so people are voting. So that civil rights bill was passed over President Johnson's veto. He opposed black suffrage, blacks getting the right to vote. Civil rights bill gives citizenship to blacks and gives them the same rights in every state and territory as enjoyed by white citizens. So the first time that we ever hear the term race riots basically is the reaction to the end of the war and the supposed liberties granted to blacks by federal law and somewhat by state law, but there are race riots. So race riots was defined before Watts in '65. Whites going into black neighborhoods, burning, looting, murdering, and this would be the term, race riots would be that term as it was applied until Watts, which was different, which was not really white people going into Watts, it was black people burning down their neighborhoods. But up until 1965, a race riot basically referred to that particular action. Meanwhile, during Reconstruction, white Democrats and police would begin race riots. So the police beginning race riots, and Democrats, of course, against the Republicans with the party of Lincoln. Democrats were basically pro-slavery and would remain so pretty much until the reverse in the 20th century, more or less. Though the Dixiecrats basically are the same folks today. So white Democrats, whites killing blacks in Memphis, the death toll 42 blacks, 2 white liberals, liberal at this point, means if, for example, Thaddeus Stevens is a radical Republican, a liberal is basically leaning towards pro-emancipation, pro-equality, but not necessarily dismantling the system that gives them privilege. Yeah.
So like center left.
Yeah, sort of like center left today, yeah. 70 wounded, 90 homes, 12 schools, 4 churches burned. In New Orleans, 40 killed, 150 wounded at a convention of black and white Republicans. So what is happening here, obviously, is law enforcement is not just standing by, they're often participating or looking the other way while violence is occurring. And then just before Black Codes, there was an equal rights meeting held by blacks in various states beginning in May of 1865. The last battle of the Civil War fought at White's Ranch, Texas, May 13th, 1865. Union soldiers informed blacks of the Emancipation Proclamation. So remember, the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation, as well as the end of the war on June 19th in Texas, leading to the celebration today of Southern blacks of what I refer to, because this is, again, my LA bias showing, the faux holiday Juneteenth. So while I have participated in Juneteenth celebrations, understand what it is. You've actually been free for a couple of years, and the white folks who are enslaving you ain't telling you free, though they know it, because they're allowed to read. So the war is over, and the war has been over for over a month. They still ain't told you they lost and you freed. And then Union soldiers come and tell you free. Late. And you make a holiday out of that? Wait, why don't you remember you free already? And that you should be constantly fighting. But maybe that's just my liberal bias. The Black Codes is not slang. Rights are given, and then rights are taken away. So at no time will rights, quote unquote, given to blacks override white skin privilege. There's always a reaction to liberation struggle. So do not mistake a temporary victory for the finish of oppression and the entrance of freedom. The chains come off, they will devise new chains. Let's see, Mos Def and his song, Mr. Nigga, they say they want you successful, but when they make it stressful, but then they make it stressful. You start keeping pace, they start shaking up the tempo. So, in defiance of federal law, black codes were written at the state level. Black codes basically enacted in Mississippi and other southern states, which essentially reinstated slavery. In some states, any white could arrest any black. Blacks could be arrested for vagrancy, and refractory and rebellious Negroes could be forced to work on road crews without pay. Now, when we talk about sundown laws, for example, like in Veneta and Springfield, well, they specify race. But in Eugene, because we're slick Klansmen, it's vagrancy. This is a phrase borrowed from the Reconstruction South. If you're not legally allowed to live within the city limits, then you're technically a vagrant. And so we cannot necessarily negate that southern influence here. So blacks owning land in Mississippi became a criminal offense, just like blacks owning land here was a criminal offense. Nor could you sue in court, nor could you vote, so again, the southern parallels to Oregon are basically inescapable. In South Carolina, blacks had to get a license to work outside of domestic and farm labor categories. And of course, if you were basically working outside of those categories without that license, you'd be naturally subject to arrest. Yes?
But to get the license, you had to be literate, so.
Yes. But theoretically, yeah, you see the double bind here. Theoretically, there were schools that allowed you to become literate if you weren't literate on your own. But, right, you had to be literate to get a license, and if you didn't have a license, yeah. And we're practicing your literacy, like trying to get paid for being literate outside of farm labor, because you don't have to be a farm laborer to be literate, right? So part of the intended outcomes for learners, basically being a critical thinker, question authority, and ask intelligent and hard to answer questions. Be a global citizen, know about what shapes your world and how other worlds are shaped. Community builder in whatever way your sense of community is built. You becoming a teacher and or facilitator, a problem solver, a dismantler of privilege, and a dispeller of ignorance. Actually, I wouldn't even mind if you became gurus. Gu from Sanskrit, dispeller of ignorance, or actually literally darkness too. Ru, bringer of light. In case you didn't know. So part of the idea in terms of like doing a class like this is saying, look, this is more than just black history. This is American history, and this is part of what's been reflected in our world. And what has once been done to us is now being applied on a larger scale outside of the United States, but even globally, and has global implications. So when they talk about, oh, we're going to bring democracy to Iraq, oh, we're going to give them democratically elected leadership, and they're going to be a democracy, yeah, not so much. How'd you guys do with that? You had black codes, they have Shia codes, now your military presence has crumbled and you got ISIS, or ISIL, whatever, which is a predictable kind of reaction in one sense. So removing those barriers. So a citizen is a person who benefits from a healthy society and is committed to maintaining that society's health to further benefit and pass those benefits on to their children, at least. That is, if they're breeders. They don't have to be breeders, but children can be, in quotes, passing on those benefits. Could we agree on that as a definition of a citizen? Then what I'm going through with here is basically the indigenous sense of, wait, you're here, you're a citizen. We don't believe in illegal immigrants in the indigenous sense. If you're here and you're contributing, we don't care where you're coming from as long as you're willing to do that. Makes sense? That's removing certain barriers. If they see a benefit in limiting their benefits they enjoy from others for fear they will lose them, then they will act in that way. So the idea is, people will limit the rights of others if they feel that their rights are being threatened, whether they are or not. So that's actually predictable that people will, well, why would you deny marriage equality? Why do you care if they're not sleeping with you? Why do you care who they sleep with? What difference does that make? Where is that coming from? I mean, among other things, as well as, what country they came from, or quote-unquote illegal immigrants, or any other barriers that we put up. So, for example, marriage equality. So in slavery, we were not allowed to have our natural sexual diversity as Africans. We were forced to be, and also Native Americans. Oh, wait, white people had sexual diversity too. So coming to America, we're not allowed to have that sexual diversity, except in small isolated pockets, like I'm thinking with Jack Mormons or certain, forms of the Mormon church where polygamy is practiced or whatever. A form of polygamy, not all forms of polygamy. Why can't a wife have many husbands? Husbands have many wives. You can't do the reverse. You can't live tribally. Anyway, marriage equality. So we're not allowed to have our natural sexual diversity, forced to be heterosexual if we were not heterosexual, and forced to be heterosexual and Christian, even if we were neither to begin with before slavery. So, but we weren't allowed to even to be heterosexually married under slavery, hence the concept of jumping the broom, which basically was an African marriage rite, basically symbolizing transition from one state to another. So we weren't, as Farrakhan pointed out at the Million Man March, we were not even allowed to be Christian for the first 78 years that this country existed. Legally, by law, because Christianity was whites only. So there were barriers to exercising equal citizenship rights, even though we had those legal citizenship rights guaranteed by law. So, for example, marriage, the vote, land ownership, military service. And we saw how in every war that America has ever had, there had been a hesitation to use black citizens to fight. From George Washington to the Civil War with Lincoln, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, we basically had sort of an integrated army, but there was still segregation. As well as Korea, as well as whatever the next thing is. So removing those barriers, right? So the Bible, that is the King James Version of the Bible, was used as a reference to deny rights to blacks, and also today, it's used to deny rights to the sexually diverse, among others. So, reason we bring up the barriers, we being not so much the royal we, but I'm talking about the liberation theological scholarship we train you for the barriers till they aren't barriers for ya. We tell you what the barriers are, try and illumine the structure that keeps the barriers in place, and partially that dismantles them. So we talk about then emotional and spiritual literacy, print literacy, numeracy, that is being able to understand numbers and numeric systems, facts, statistics, etc., and then system literacy. How systems are put together. How the system is put together. Like where it comes from. So some of what we're dealing with today came out of Reconstruction, as well as the Revolutionary War, and then what came after that, too. So calling attention to, within the book, voting, Mississippi legislature, miscegenation. So what miscegenation is basically race mixing, essentially. Even though, again, biologically, there's, as we talked about in the midterm, biologically there's one race, the human race. But politically, where people exercise power, because politics is the science of power, people can construct power systems to empower everybody or to disempower certain people and empower other people. And so our constructs of race can do that too. So the idea of race mixing. Well, who's allowed to mix with who and why? And why do they mix to begin with? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? So those references within To Make Our World Anew, basically are specific pages that talked about that. And generally speaking, this is a technique of coming out of Paulo Freire's work, Conscientizzação, which is basically learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. So, for example, David Bradley. David is a UFO professor now, came here from somewhere else. He wrote a book called The Cheneyville Incident. From, if you remember, The Stillness Which Comes to All, I adapted that. But he also has a scathing, shall we say, scatology of class differences in America. Are you familiar with the term scatology? Well, anytime you put ology, out of the Latin or Greek, I believe it is, in front of, on the back, ology means study of, scat is poop.
I thought you meant like jazz, scat, like he had
Scatting, yeah, right, okay, so, good idea, hey, right, scatology, that's some good shit. Jazz scatting is basically improvising vocally using vocables. Vocables, like, for example, in Native American singing, so there's words, and then there's vocables, which are word-like sounds, but they're not words, they're basically like musical expression. So scatting is, in jazz, is basically the latter. You can use words, but you can also use word-like sounds, too.
Boobop should be,
Boobop shabop, right. So, from the Cheneyville incident. For one of the primary functions of societal institutions is to conceal the basic nature of the society, so that the individuals that make up the power structure can pursue the business of consolidating and increasing their power, untroubled by the minor carpings of a dissatisfied peasantry. Okay, so clearly he's basically talking about our system having, our society having roots in feudal genetic monarchies. Even though the founding fathers didn't want to have a king, and they clearly did not want a president to be a king, they also just as clearly did not want the common people running stuff, too. So they had to have a way of separating things out. Societal institutions act as fig leaves for each other's nakedness. The church justifies the actions of the state, the teachings of the school, the principles of the economy, the pronouncements of the church. See how this works in this circular, even though this is a work of fiction, his analysis is spot on, because you can't deny that, right? And hey, a black writer basically talking about, he's just making up, his whole book is making up a story about why these 13 graves existed in this house in Pennsylvania, separate from the family, that didn't have slaves' quarters. So he basically just made up the story, and maybe it's not made up, that, maybe these were, the Underground Railroad did run through here. Maybe these people just couldn't escape, and suddenly all died together, because there's kids and women and children and, no battlefield. So what is it? So this particular character is basically breaking this down in terms of looking at the structures of society. Truly efficient societies conceal the true nature of the operations, motivations, and goals of all but the most minor institutions, some even managing to control the appearance of the local parish, courthouse, board of education, and chambers of commerce. right? So you are meant to be the church, the state, the school, the economy, that is business, and then the economy, the pronouncements of the church. They are meant to be interrelated, but you are not meant to see the connections. Because we believe in the separation of church and state. All right? But capitalism worships money. And is based on, boom, the pronouncements of the church that said these people were God-given to us to serve us. So capitalism based on amoral slavery. Oh, well, they're not actually people. They're 3/5 of a person. So whatever you do to them, well, you can destroy your own property, but I can, so what I mean by that, for example, take in Texas, we haven't gotten to the James Byrd killing in the late 90s, but those guys were sentenced to death. Two of them were sentenced to death for killing James Byrd, but the last white person in Texas who was sentenced to death and executed for killing a black person was in slavery before James Byrd, which is not to say the last white person convicted of killing a black person. So the person who killed another man's slave, that's like in Texas, like we hang horse thieves. It was perfectly legal for you to kill your own slave. But if somebody kills your slave, that's destroying your property. I can kill you for that. And that's what happened, right? So it's the pronouncements of the church that says, oh, slavery's okay. It's moral. You can, don't kill your own, don't destroy your own property, but if a man destroys your property, you have right to recompense. You can rape this woman, get her pregnant, sell your child without feeling that it's your child, because it's not really human, even though it's your child, right? And that's the basis of capitalism. That's what built this country. That form of capitalism that says, we don't have to worry about morals or our relationship to other people. And the church said that's okay. And so did the school, and so did the economy, and then the economy, they're all related, right? And truly efficient societies conceal that true nature. Now, it's not like we couldn't construct a society that's more equitable. We could do that. But it's hard to think about what that would look like because of the force of our education. But even the most efficient society loses control at some point. No society, for example, is so efficient that it can disguise the nature of its sanitary facilities. And so, when seeking to understand the culture or the history of a people, do not look at the precepts of the religion, the form of the government, the curricula of the schools, or the operation of businesses. Flush the Johns. I first burst out laughing. Wait, the Johns? Wait a minute. Really? That's scatology. America is a class society. If you doubt it, consider the sanitary facilities employed by America's three modes of public long-distance transportation: airplanes, trains, and buses. Okay. Airplanes in air terminal bathroom facilities, cleaned and most expensive to access. Right? Makes sense. Trains, the next most. Buses and bus terminals, the most public, hence the poorest. Yes?
And guess who rides the buses?
Aha. Right.
Guess who flies the jets?
And guess who flies the jets? Right. So if you don't think America is a class society,
Doesn't first class even have their own bathroom?
First class even has their own bathroom. Right.
Which is
Nicer soap.
in the front of the plane.
And in first class, in aircraft, you get better food.
Bigger seats.
Bigger seats. You can even have a whole section where you can basically have your own little pod that flattens down into a bed with cable TV and free accessories and for entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, right. So, I mean, when he's talking about, oh, well, we don't have class societies, he's saying, look, if you understand that the divisions have to be hidden to keep people quiet, that's what's going on. So there's structured class differences. And not just class, but I mean, class is one of the ways that we can definitely look, because part of the default setting of being in college is middle class. To the degree that middle class is going to continue to exist, right? So some class differences are aligned racially as well. So skin color can be associated with economic benefits. Certainly the lighter skin you have, the more money you can make, depending on what the context, the industry, the job is. There was a piece in the paper yesterday basically talking about, while we have STEM, that is science, technology, what is it, not education, and math, engineering and math, okay? And we're basically doing specific outreach to women and minorities in that particular workforce. What they're finding is that women who are being trained to enter the tech fields are leaving it, because they're basically finding, whoa, I've been here at Google or whatever for 15 years, and they keep hiring dudes with less experience over me. And they say, well, I just think he could complete the project better than you. Well, that's not a reason. That's discrimination.
The glass ceiling.
There's a glass ceiling within tech. And so women are basically finding, I should just leave, because this is not, I'm not going to get any equity here, right? So class differences, gender differences, skin color can be a barrier, and gender can be a barrier too. So whether it's lighter skin, straighter hair, blue eyes, short, non-ethnic hair, or whether you sit or stand to pee, it can be a divider. Bradley was basically focusing on race because that's where the book was focusing on, but basically we can see that there are hidden divisions along several particular categories. So, the model of freedom. So one model of freedom, to ask this question this particular way. So part of the model of freedom is based on the mimetics of race. That is based on appearance, or geography, or national origin, or biology. So the 19th century, that is the 1800s, that is Reconstruction, the time period we're talking about. 19th century memes were based on Romanized Christian dominant memes. That is a white Jesus, a Bible-based race policy, i.e. God made the races separate, and on separate continents, it's a sin to mix them. So people actually believe that particular interpretation. They talk about amalgamation and miscegenation. So amalgamation, basically if you still have mercury fillings in your teeth, all right? The amalgam is mercury, silver, some other metals. That's the amalgam. And miscegenation. So mixing till one race disappears. This is fear of white annihilation, which is one of the things that drives that policy. Like, okay, it's not rational, but fear often isn't rational. So really, white people have been around genetically as a phenotype, if you understand the difference that I'm meaning. So genotype is what's in your genes. Phenotype is how your genes express. Right? What you look like, whose hair you got, whether you get a dimple in your chin, et cetera, excellent suntan, maybe suntan deficient, I don't know. Anyway. However that works, right? So, since the appearance of the quote-unquote white phenotype 22,000 years ago, right? So that's how long white people have been around, 22,000 years, according to the same science that gives us, black people being the oldest All right, white people last to emerge 22,000 years ago. Nobody's tried to eliminate them in terms of world war, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody, right? So where is the fear of annihilation? Well, if we mix, does that mean that everybody's going to be olive skin? Not necessarily. Any more than, I'm jumping ahead in terms of what we'll be talking about in time, but so for example, you may or may not know that Alexander Graham Bell is considered like Hitler among deaf people. And the reason he's considered like Hitler is because he was a believer in eugenics. And so one of the things that he believed, wrongly, because of the science, has proved him wrong, but he couldn't know that at the time, that deaf people, if two deaf parents get together and have a kid, the kid is hearing. But by his science, his view of the science, he believed that such people were defective and that you shouldn't get together and sexually because you'd have a race, their words, of quote-unquote defectives.
So they should not be allowed to breed.
So they should not be allowed to breed. Now, hearing parents can produce a deaf child, and deaf parents can produce a hearing child. That is our working experience, basically. So his fear is unfounded in the science. But again, like many of these fears, like in terms of amalgamation and miscegenation, believing that white people are going to be disappearing, and the only way to keep them from disappearing is by prohibiting the races from mixing. So it's okay to mix with slaves. That's just good breeding practices, right? So we have these curious dissensions. And even, for example, Samuel Thurston talking about forbidding blacks from coming to Oregon. Oh, blacks mix with Indians. And if they mix with Indians, then you'll have a hostile race, hostile to white people. So we got to prevent that from happening by preventing black people from happening. So again, 19th century racial memes driven by a particular version of the Bible, non-scientific, almost an anti-scientific, though the science at the time, remember, we haven't come to this part, we haven't talked about this part, but there was, did I mention Western medicine didn't believe in germs in this time? I didn't mention that. Western medicine did not believe in germs at this time. Okay? So imagine Western medicine today with no germs, with no germ theory. Well, we can't imagine that, right? Because we got soap dispensers to avoid a particular flu. They're vaccinating people from meningococcus, over at the UFO. Right, germ theory. But imagine, during this time, there's no germ theory in medicine. So when we're talking about the 19th century, we have come a long way, baby, in some ways. But in other ways, we haven't come so far in terms of our information around science. So to go back to Alexander Graham Bell, so not only did he not want he wanted deaf people to be sterilized so that they wouldn't create a whole race of deaf people. He didn't want black deaf people and white deaf people getting together either. He actually wanted, and to prevent that, he wanted a separate American Sign Language for black people and white people to keep them from getting together. Right, okay, we know him. We hearing people know Alexander Graham, the inventor of the telephone. He's cool, right? Just like Henry Ford. Oh, another racist, but right. So when we talk about the model of freedom, people are free to think anything they want. Right or wrong, scientifically validated or not, you can believe what you want to believe, but does that belief impinge upon other people's right to exist? So when we talk about, amalgamation, so mixing till one race disappears, the fear of white annihilation, look, nobody's got it in for white people. Nobody's trying to make them disappear. There's no Holocaust except, well, that's white people doing it to white people. Well, nobody's trying to get rid of you. And then mixing of the races, creating colorism as a barrier. So when I'm talking about cultural enhancement, I'm talking about the things that make us, shall we say, spiritually and culturally and more human as people, rather than suppressing those. So to inhibit freedom, you limit access by creating a visible reward system that furthers a divide and conquer agenda. Whether you believe the Willie Lynch letter, for example, when we talked about that several weeks ago, is real or not. Doesn't matter whether you believe it's apocryphal or not. The effect is as if it's happening. Colorism is real. Our blonde-haired, blue-eyed ideals of beauty come from Caucasian sex slaves, literally women of the Caucasus, who were captured and sold by white people, sold them to the rich black guys in their harems. Because again, who has a harem? Where does that come from? Right? And this is in The History of White People, Nell Irvin Painter, who is a black woman at Yale. I mean, it's a great book, too. So somebody was asking me, if you were going to get picked 5 books from your book list, so that'd be one. It depends. I mean, for me, it was funny. It was hilarious because, I've been teaching this stuff, so it was nice to find all this in one place and...
Active support.
Yeah, active support, right? So, radical Republicans. So, Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania in the House, Charles Sumner, Massachusetts, the senator. What is the answer to white supremacy? So, radical Republicans, if I hadn't explained what radical Republicans are, and we're jumping back in time again to this Reconstruction, these guys, along with Frederick Douglass, are the radical Republicans, and radical means, and this is the first use of that term in American politics, so notice how in American politics being radical is not a good thing. It's not considered a good thing. So the radical Republicans basically believed essentially we need to end white supremacy, period. And we're white saying this, okay? So in the movie Lincoln, where Thaddeus Stevens is portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones, and he's basically living as husband and wife with his black housekeeper who may or may not be free. She might actually be they're living in D.C., right? Or even Pennsylvania, where they had slaves, right? So they're living together as husband and wife, but it's illegal for them to be married. They clearly love each other. So whether that is stretching the truth or not, I'm thinking not, because Stevens had himself buried in a black cemetery. So if you can believe that, cemeteries were segregated. People tripped. Really, does it matter where you are when you're dead? They apparently thought so. So they even segregated cemeteries. Thaddeus Stevens had himself buried in a black cemetery. Probably next to her. But as a general principle. So Stevens and Sumner, of the two, Stevens basically came out best because Sumner basically got beaten up in Congress and suffered a brain injury, as we know, and had to retire. Stevens did not, because basically this is a time when you could basically have duels in Congress or outside of Congress, right? To defend your sacred honor. These guys, and Sumner basically, if you remember, basically sued to end school discrimination in Massachusetts on behalf of a black client. So what was radical about the Republicans, these radical Republicans, is they were to the left of Lincoln. Lincoln, in our today's nomenclature, would be a moderate. So if you remember last week, we were talking about that meeting with Frederick Douglass. Oh, our races can't get together. Y'all should go to Costa Rica. No. Stevens and Sumner are basically saying, no, the solution to slavery is to end slavery. Let's start there. 2, give the slaves recompense for their labor, 40 acres and a mule. Give them education, give them the vote, eliminate all basis of racial segregation, period. Eliminate white supremacy, period. End of discussion. That's radical. For 1865, that's radical. As my daughter would point out, it's a thin line between radical and common sense. Bless you, baby. Who raised you? Yeah.
But I mean, I wonder how and why did certain people escape that sort of irrational white paranoia?
I hate to say this, but I'm thinking divine providence. I had this conversation with Senator Hatfield. I said, I don't understand how you took the positions you took at the time that you took them. What in your upbringing? He said, well, I was just Christian. But wait, stop. Other Christians are creating segregation that you're fighting against. Other Christians, like he was put on an Senator Hatfield, Governor Hatfield, Senator Hatfield, was put on an FBI list because his high school friends that were Japanese were being loaded onto a train and sent to concentration camps. And he got put on an FBI list because he was crying that his friend, an American citizen, was being sent to concentration camp because of the color of his skin. He was embarrassed that we haven't talked about this time period yet. When it's coming up next term, tune in, register early so that the class will go. He was embarrassed at the treatment of Paul Robeson in 1941 when he sang in Salem. The best hotel in Salem wouldn't allow Paul to stay here because he was black. So the young Mark Hatfield drove Paul Robeson from Salem to the Benson in Portland, put him up in the hotel, borrowed the family car to do it, and basically talked about their conversation. Yeah, what do you talk about with Paul Robeson? He said, well, he's a genius. He was a genius, but he made you feel like you were on his level. And he basically just laughed off the discrimination thing, like, it's just funny. Yeah, but it could have hurt him, but it was funny, it was bizarre. And so Hatfield then had, enlisted in the Navy, was at Iwo Jima in a landing craft, walked through Hiroshima a couple of days after the bomb, and that basically cemented his anti-war stance. That's why he was against the war in Vietnam, among other things, on a principled stance. Like, wait, not only is war wrong, but even though I was a soldier, right, Ho Chi Minh was our ally. They've been fighting, he fought the Japanese and won. And the Vietnamese have been fighting the French and the Chinese for like a combined 1,000 years to have their own country. And this guy quotes Thomas Jefferson in The Rights of Man. Look, Ho Chi Minh, protested the lynching of black soldiers when no president would even say a word about that. So he was a communist, sure, but it was our communist. And you can't accuse Mark Hatfield of being disloyal to America. More of a hero than Boehner. But I could understand why he wouldn't run for president. Because, okay, you can support Ronald Reagan, but please, you would definitely be a better president than Ronald Reagan. Or Bush. Or any of them. I could support. Senator's been dead for years now, but part of the piece. I just said, you know, you're more of a radical Republican. This is not the party of Lincoln. You're more like Sumner and Stevens, which he took as a compliment. And I meant it as a compliment, not trying to suck up to him. I mean, this is the mold that you're in, not Reagan, not Bush. You know, you take intelligent, principled stands. It's hard to see that in politicians these days. Can I get an amen? Congregation say amen.
So these men probably had some sort of just a flash of enlightenment.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where, I mean, he basically said Senator Hatfield said it was his upbringing. Okay, fine. I get that. But the roots of being freedom and a patriot in the sense that Sumner and Stevens are a patriot took hold in him in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of Republicans lately. Though there are some. There are some. I like Colin Powell. Condi Rice, I like her intellect. I'm not certain about some of her positions, but Colin Powell, I can definitely be down with. So when we talk about amalgamation and miscegenation, amalgamation means mixing till you can no longer distinguish between the separate elements. Where this becomes an issue is where there's an elemental belief in racial superiority. So if we look at the history underlying those beliefs, so Sally Heming and Tommy Jefferson. Sorry if somebody's thinking I'm being disrespectful to a president, a founding father. Well, I am. But, you know, like I had said before, Sally Heming was a slave, his slave, but she was the half-sister of his wife and favored his wife. So definitely they were lovers, definitely they had kids, definitely part of his debt burden was the fact that he owed money for his kids. And this is part of the essential issue that I have with what I refer to as amoral capitalism, though my Marxist friends would say there is no such thing as moral capitalism. I tend to disagree with them. Yeah, there is a moral. Okay? The moral is you have a responsibility to take care of other people with your wealth. That's why you have it. And not treat people as if they were your own family, and hopefully that's not abusive. Thomas Jefferson did not do that with his own kin. All right, the racial model that he was working under, and clearly she loved him, because when they traveled to France, she was automatically freed being on French soil. She could have left him, and chose not to. So that amalgamation piece is a two-edged sword, because we can't basically say that black people were without agency even in slavery. They do have agency. They're still human. I mean, this is contrasting with what happened with Charlotte and George across the pond. Look, Thomas Jefferson pens the Declaration of Independence, and he's basically railing against George. Well, okay, George was crazy. Demonstrably had because of inbreeding, genetic inbreeding, he had a mental illness. But he also loved his wife, Charlotte, a black woman, who, not subject to decades of inbreeding, was still intelligent and not insane. Right? So whatever wrongs that Thomas Jefferson thinks is being committed by George III, some of those are being mediated by Charlotte. So the relationship of two interracial couples, isn't it weird to think of Thomas Jefferson as an interracial couple? But he was, right? And England, which gets rid of slavery first, before America, but not class division. So let's see. I'm not going to go there, but I am going to go to colorism, I think. Yeah. Let me show you something. Open recent draft. Day 2, week 9 draft. Yes, I think it's useful for you to see a construct of colorism that I usually showed only when talking about axiology. But since we don't have time to do axiology in 5 minutes, but we do have time to do colorism. Here we go. Come on. You can do it, little computer. All right. Joyce Landrum Brown did a study on colorism. So here's what it is. A related concept is color consciousness, sometimes known in the literature as the color complex. Defining the color complex as a psychological fixation about color and features that leads blacks to discriminate against each other. So where racism is basically applied from outside of a category of race, colorism is applied internally as a form of self-oppression. A further note that traditionally the color complex involved light-skinned blacks' rejection of blacks who were darker. However, the color complex also shows up in terms of dark-skinned African Americans spurning their lighter-skinned brothers and sisters for not being black enough. Now, the reason I put this right here originally was basically Thomas Jefferson, among others, codified this whole racial category in which lighter skin became more valued, and that form of race mixing became definitely encouraged, as well as mixing, for example, settlers mixing with native women and killing off the native men, and then producing a race of mixed race white and native folks that would eventually eliminate the native race altogether. The complex included attitudes about hair, texture, lip size, body shape, nose shape, and eye color. Color struck was a term coined for blacks who regularly made distinctions based on skin color. At the personal level, colorism is a set of beliefs. On the other hand, when a group or individual has the power to institutionalize and enforce behaviors, laws, norms, and standards based on beliefs of skin color superiority or inferiority, then colorism takes on a whole new dimension. The battle against colorism needs to be waged at the personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels. Now, colorism could date back to the Willie Lynch letter in the 1700s. You could trace it back to that. But it would definitely become more powerful in Reconstruction as another divide and rule strategy. Because who gets to become powerful? Who's allowed to access to education? At the institutional and cultural level, colorism is skin color prejudice plus sanctioning power. Colorism develops when personal opinion and individual biases are codified as norms, and doctrines then enforce as societal behaviors and institutional practices. Today's society, skin color provides a stimulus cue to thoughts and emotions regarding personal perception in interpersonal relationships. So color differences sometimes become the primary symbol of the racial differences by the members of color-stratified, hierarchically organized society. That is, darkest on the bottom, lightest on the top. You can see this in India. There are no light-skinned untouchables. But the Brahmin class and the warrior class tend to be lighter skinned. Also, who becomes the consumer of skin lightening creams? Okay, what actors and role models are doing that? So, for example, you're black. High yellow, radical red bone, the paper bag test, also known as bougie beige, cafe accompli, mocha mania, Mississippi mud, cackalack black soil, ebony jet, or blurple. These are terms used internal to the culture. I could be considered, let's see, where am I in here? Somewhere between red bone. Well, I'm definitely red bone, according to this African who said, yes, I can see that you're mixed with Native American. Yeah, how can you say that? Whatever. Fine. So traditionally, the color complex invites light-skinned black rejection of blacks who are darker. The color complex also shows up in terms of dark-skinned African Americans spurning their lighter-skinned brothers and sisters for not being black enough. So, glamour Barbie. Two different things of Beyonce. For a color ad, and also, whoa, is that her natural hair color? And her natural skin color? Has that been photoshopped? Yes. And, notice her hair. It definitely looked black at the roots, but yeah. So I'll leave these up later today. She discusses the various stratifications within race and colorism. And let's call it a day. I will actually have have your test back, and we'll also discuss the midterm and the final, and hand out evaluations, etc. Wednesday. All right, roll music.